Picture this, you're standing in a cattle market in rural England, and you are not here to buy anything. You are the item being sold. It's 1842. Rain slicks the dirt beneath your bare feet. A rope is tied tight around your waist, held by the man who once promised to love you. Your husband stands on a crate, pint in hand, announcing to the crowd your name, your age, your temperament, loud enough to drown out your shame. Good worker, fair looks, a bit stubborn when she's crossed. The men laugh. You stand still. Your eyes don't meet theirs. Around you, pigs squeal in their pens and muddy boots splash as strangers circle like buyers at an auction. One man steps forward, asks if you're clean. Another wants to know if you've had children. Your husband jokes, one boy, strong like me. A few coins are exchanged. A handshake seals it. And suddenly, you belong to someone else. No judge. No documents. Just mud, ale, and an invisible contract society pretends is law. You're not here because you wanted this. You're here because divorce is for the wealthy. Because the courts don't care if your husband beats you, drinks everything you earn, or sleeps with women in front of your children. You're here because there is no other way out. And the horrific part? No one's surprised. No one gasps. They've seen this before, dozens of times. Selling a wife is just what men do when they're poor and want to move on. And you're the price of their freedom. In 1857, in the village of Selby, Yorkshire, a man named William Alderton brought his wife, Elizabeth, to the marketplace. He tied a rope around her neck and led her like an animal through the crowd. The townspeople didn't stop him. They watched. They laughed. They drank. And when William shouted her price, 1 shilling and a dog, someone actually agreed. The dog was a black mongrel, the shilling was tarnished, and the woman, Elizabeth, was 26 years old. That was the cost of her life. There were no protests, no arrests. In fact, a constable stood nearby and reportedly chuckled along. Because in the eyes of working-class England, wife selling wasn't a crime. It was tradition. The law didn't officially recognize the sale as legal, but it also didn't forbid it. And so, like dozens of other men before him, William found his loophole. He wanted out of the marriage. He couldn't afford a divorce. So he turned to the marketplace and found a buyer. Elizabeth wasn't a person to be consulted. She was property to be transferred. And the truly horrific part: she may have welcomed the exchange. Her new owner was a local man named Henry Mears, someone she may have already known. Historians suspect the whole thing was prearranged. But even then, the price, the dog, the coin, the public rope, remained. Because even when the wife agreed, society demanded a show. Humiliation was part of the process. To leave your husband, you had to be sold. To buy a wife, you had to treat her like livestock. And so, Elizabeth Alderton's name joined a long, ugly list of women auctioned off in plain sight, while the system applauded with silence. In 1832, a woman named Hannah Matthews was sold in the market square of Birmingham while a constable stood just a few feet away. She was tied with a sash, not a rope, because, as her husband claimed, she's finer than cattle. The crowd laughed. The buyer paid 5 shillings and a quart of gin. No one intervened. Not the policeman. Not the clergy. Not the magistrates. Because by then, wife selling had become an unofficial institution, a vulgar performance the courts refused to confront. Legally, the practice held no weight. It wasn't sanctioned. But it wasn't punished either. Judges dismissed such cases as private arrangements. Politicians scoffed at them as rural oddities. And yet, it happened everywhere, from Yorkshire to Somerset, in cities and villages, from the late 1700s well into the 1860s. The reason? The divorce system was deliberately broken. Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, divorce required an Act of Parliament, an ordeal so expensive and time-consuming that only the elite could pursue it. For everyone else, marriage was a trap, especially for women. Men, desperate for escape, turned to public markets. And officials, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of class prejudice, looked the other way. There were moments of discomfort, occasional editorials condemning the custom, rare attempts at legal intervention, but they were brief and half-hearted. As long as there was no open violence, the act of selling one's wife was treated as vulgar but forgivable. A public joke. A poor man's divorce. And so, one woman after another was paraded through crowds with rope, ribbon, or reins, while the courts, the church, and the law quietly decided that the shame belonged to her, not to them. In 1829, Sarah Davis was led into a cattle fair in Wiltshire, bound at the wrist with a handkerchief. Her husband declared her no longer wanted and offered her to the highest bidder. Sarah didn't resist. In fact, she was seen smiling. That image, of a woman seemingly pleased to be sold, became the excuse many used to justify the practice. She wanted it, they said. She agreed. But beneath that smile was a far crueler truth. Sometimes, being sold was the only way out. Women like Sarah had no legal power to divorce, no right to keep their children, no income of their own. If they fled, they could be arrested for desertion. If they stayed, they often endured years of poverty, abuse, or neglect. In that system, a public sale could feel like escape, even salvation. Some were sold to lovers with whom they had secretly arranged the deal. Others were passed to strangers, simply for a change of fate. But consent in these transactions was always murky. Agreeing to a sale under threat of starvation or violence is not freedom, it's survival. And for every Sarah who went willingly, there were others like Mary Wilkins of Staffordshire, who sobbed as she was dragged to market, or Elizabeth Campbell, whose husband beat her until she stood silently beside a sign that read, "For sale, with all faults." Even in cases where the wife said nothing, silence didn't mean agreement. It meant she had no voice. So while the public clung to the fiction of mutual consent, because it made everything easier to stomach, the reality was far darker. These women weren't negotiating their futures. They were surrendering to a world that offered no better options. In 1830, a man in Manchester sold his wife for a quart of beer. In another case, a woman named Nancy Holmes was traded for a sheepdog and a bag of onions. These were not metaphors. These were literal transactions, executed in public, finalized with a handshake, and observed by drunken crowds. The prices weren't just low, they were insulting. They were meant to be. To sell a wife wasn't only to be rid of her, it was to shame her, to reduce her to less than livestock. In many sales, the buyer would toss a coin into the seller's ale mug to seal the deal. One man accepted a gallon of ale and a cocked hat. Another threw in a pair of worn boots to sweeten the bargain. The absurdity was part of the performance. It allowed men to reframe their failure, not as abandonment, but as crude comedy. For them, it wasn't just about leaving a wife, it was about publicly asserting control over her body, her name, and her worth. And society played along. Crowds jeered. Newspapers printed the stories like village gossip columns. Some towns even hosted multiple sales a year. Rarely did anyone question what it meant when a woman was sold for less than a pig. The humiliation was the point. It wasn't enough for her to leave, she had to leave broken. The lower the price, the greater the signal, she's worthless now. And in a world where women had no right to property, to legal protection, or to dignity, being sold for beer wasn't just dehumanizing, it was predictable. It was never just a transaction, it was theater. When John Barlow sold his wife in Sheffield in 1837, over 300 people gathered to watch. They jeered, cheered, and tossed coins. Local papers described it as a lively afternoon. But this wasn't unusual. In towns across England, wife sales were treated like events. People skipped work to attend. Children watched. Bakers sold bread nearby. And no one seemed to ask, what exactly were they celebrating? For the crowd, it was a rare moment when someone lower than them was on display. A wife, shamed in public, stripped of her name and dignity, was a spectacle that confirmed society's cruel hierarchy. If she cried, they laughed. If she stood silently, they judged. If she protested, they mocked her. The market square transformed into a courtroom where guilt had already been assumed, and the punishment was humiliation. Even worse, many believed they were witnessing fairness. Better than adultery, they'd say. At least he didn't just abandon her. This moral fiction allowed communities to pretend they were witnessing justice, not degradation. Humor papered over horror. Some towns even developed ritualistic language, sold with all faults or no returns, as if a human life were no different than a used plow. The act became so embedded that the crowd's laughter served as social approval. If enough people cheered, then surely it wasn't wrong. And for those watching, especially the men, it offered something intoxicating: control, superiority, and the comfort of knowing that someone else's shame would entertain them for a day. In the end, the market wasn't just a place for buying wives, it was a mirror, reflecting exactly what the public thought a woman was worth. It didn't end because society suddenly found its conscience. It ended because the law finally caught up, slowly, reluctantly, and only after public embarrassment. By the mid-19th century, England was changing. The rise of the industrial middle class brought new values: respectability, domestic order, and moral reform. Wife-selling clashed with that image. It looked primitive, vulgar, dangerously un-British. The press began to market less as comedy and more as scandal. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act passed, an extraordinary shift. For the first time, ordinary people could seek civil divorce through special courts, without needing an act of parliament. It was far from perfect. Men still had far more legal power than women, but it cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for centuries. Suddenly, there was an alternative to the marketplace. And as divorce became more accessible, wife-selling lost its twisted justification. But the practice didn't vanish overnight. In 1881, a woman named Susan Lomas was sold in Sheffield. In 1887, another case surfaced in Leeds. Even into the early 1900s, a few scattered incidents still occurred, quietly, in poor towns, where shame and desperation clung like smoke. What truly ended wife-selling wasn't just legislation, but silence. As the Victorian age marched into modernity, no one wanted to admit how long they had accepted it. The newspapers stopped reporting it. Officials refused to acknowledge it ever existed in law. The nation buried its own complicity. And the women, thousands of them, sold across generations, were left unnamed, unwritten, and erased. Their stories survived only in footnotes and folklore. But their pain was real. And behind every shilling, every rope, every cheer from the crowd, was a single, horrific truth: they were sold because there was nowhere else to go.